The 911 operator's voice cut through the static like a blade. 911, what's your emergency? My daughter, she's hurting herself again. Please, I need an ambulance. James Mitchell's voice cracked as he watched 6-year-old Emma slam her head against the marble kitchen counter with the mechanical precision of a metronome. Blood trickled from her forehead, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Her twin brothers, Alex and Ben, cowered in the corner, hands pressed over their ears as their sister's anguished screams filled the $3 million penthouse overlooking Central Park. This was the third emergency call this month. The neighbors had started complaining. Child Protective Services had started asking questions. Sir, is this the Mitchell residence on East 72nd Street? The operator's tone shifted, becoming clinical. Professional. They knew this address by heart. Yes, James whispered, watching caregiver number 12 gather her things with the desperate speed of someone fleeing a crime scene. Mrs. Patterson, 63 years old with 3 decades of childcare experience, couldn't handle 3 autistic 6-year-olds for even one morning. Paramedics are en route, Mr. Mitchell. This is the 4th call this quarter. Sir, we need to discuss. James hung up. He couldn't hear about residential facilities again. Couldn't face another conversation about how his children might be better served somewhere else. Somewhere away from him. As sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each second, James made a decision that would change everything. He scrolled through his contacts and found a number he'd been avoiding for weeks. A woman who claimed she could help families like his, families that everyone else had given up on. But when he looked out the window, he saw something that stopped his heart cold. A woman was standing across the street, watching his building. She'd been there for hours, just waiting. And in her hand was a manila folder with his children's names written on the front. The sirens were getting closer. The woman across the street started walking toward his building. And James realized that whatever happened next would either save his family or destroy it completely. The paramedics knew the way to the Mitchell penthouse by heart. 3rd time this month they'd been called to East 72nd Street. 3rd time they'd found James Mitchell standing helplessly in his marble kitchen while his 6-year-old daughter Emma destroyed herself piece by piece. Same as always, Mr. Mitchell? Rebecca Santos, the lead paramedic, spoke with the weary kindness of someone who'd seen too much pain to judge anyone for it. At 42, she'd been running emergency calls in Manhattan for 15 years, but the Mitchell family had become her most heartbreaking regular case. James nodded, watching as Rebecca gently approached Emma, who was still banging her head against the kitchen counter with the relentless rhythm of a broken clock. The little girl's dark curls were matted with sweat and tears, her face flushed with the exhaustion that came after a complete neurological storm. "Hey, sweetheart," Rebecca whispered, not touching Emma but moving slowly into her line of sight. "Big feelings today?" Emma's movement slowed, then stopped. She looked up at Rebecca with eyes that held too much pain for someone so small, and nodded once. The twins, Alex and Ben, emerged from their hiding spot behind the breakfast counter. At 6 years old, they were small for their age, with their father's green eyes and their late mother's sensitive spirit. Alex clutched his collection of smooth stones, his tactile anchors in a world that often felt too overwhelming to navigate. Ben held a picture book about trains, though James knew his son had memorized every word months ago. "Is Emma going to the quiet place again?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The quiet place was what they called the hospital's pediatric psychiatric unit, where Emma went when her meltdowns became dangerous to herself. "Just for a little while," Rebecca said gently, "until her feelings get smaller." Mrs. Patterson, caregiver number 12, had already fled. Her resignation email was probably being typed from the safety of her car in the building's parking garage. James couldn't blame her. In 3 hours, she'd witnessed Emma's headbanging meltdown, Alex's complete shutdown when his morning routine was disrupted, and Ben's selective mutism becoming total silence. For someone trained in typical child development, his family must have seemed like a disaster waiting to happen. As the paramedics prepared Emma for transport, a routine they'd perfected over months of practice. James caught sight of the woman across the street. She was still there, still watching. Mid-30s, wearing a gray wool coat despite the October heat, holding what looked like a thick manila folder. "Rebecca," James said quietly, pulling the paramedic aside. "That woman across the street. Have you seen her before?" Rebecca glanced out the window, her expression shifting to something James couldn't read. "Maya Santos. She's my sister." The words hit James like a physical blow. "Your sister? She's been watching your family for weeks, James. She knows about the emergency calls, the failed caregivers, Rebecca's voice dropped even lower. "She knows about the custody hearing next week." James felt his blood run cold. The custody hearing was supposed to be confidential. Rebecca's parents had hired lawyers to prove he was an unfit father, but how could a stranger know about sealed court proceedings? "Maya has a gift with children like yours," Rebecca continued, glancing toward the ambulance where Emma was being secured with the gentle efficiency of people who understood that restraints meant safety, not punishment. "She's worked with families that everyone else gave up on. Families like yours. Why hasn't she?" "Because she has a rule. She only helps families who are ready to hear the truth about what their children really need. And James, until today you weren't ready." The ambulance doors closed with Emma inside, her small face visible through the rear window. She wasn't crying anymore, just staring out at her brothers with the resigned expression of a child who'd learned that love sometimes meant leaving. "What truth?" James asked, but Rebecca was already walking toward the ambulance. "Ask Maya," she called over her shoulder. "She'll be waiting when you get back from the hospital." As the ambulance pulled away, sirens cutting through the Manhattan morning like a knife through silk, James looked across the street again. Maya Santos was walking toward his building, the manila folder clutched against her chest like armor. And for the first time in 3 years of failing his children, James Mitchell was about to meet someone who claimed she could succeed where everyone else had failed. The question was, what would success cost him? James Mitchell returned from Mount Sinai Hospital at 2:47 p.m., his expensive Italian shoes echoing against the marble lobby of his building like gunshots in a cathedral. Emma would be kept overnight for observation, again, while child psychiatrists ran tests that never revealed anything he didn't already know. His daughter was autistic, overwhelmed, and slowly disappearing into a world he couldn't reach. Tony the doorman, a 60-year-old Puerto Rican man who'd worked the building for 15 years, looked up from his newspaper with the expression of someone about to deliver bad news. "Mr. Mitchell, that woman. She's been waiting in the lobby for 3 hours. Says she won't leave until you talk to her." James's heart hammered against his ribs as he turned toward the seating area. Maya Santos sat perfectly still in one of the leather chairs, the manila folder balanced on her lap like a weapon she wasn't quite ready to use. Up close, she was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5 feet 4 inches with delicate features that belied the steel in her dark eyes. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothes were practical rather than fashionable, worn jeans, a soft gray sweater, and boots that looked like they'd walked through more storms than sunshine. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, rising gracefully as he approached. Her voice carried a slight Spanish accent, warm honey with an undertone of authority that made him think of teachers he'd respected and feared in equal measure. "I'm Maya Santos. We need to talk." "About what?" James asked, though his throat felt like sandpaper. Something about this woman's calm certainty unnerved him more than Emma's worst meltdowns. "About why your children are trying to hurt themselves to communicate with you. About why 12 caregivers have failed in 18 months. About why you're 3 days away from losing custody of the 3 most remarkable children I've ever observed." The words hit him like physical blows. "How do you know about the custody hearing?" Maya's smile was sad, knowing. "Because I've been watching your family for 6 weeks, James." "May I call you James?" "I've seen the emergency calls, the revolving door of caregivers, the way your children's behaviors escalate every time someone new enters their environment. I've also seen something else, something the courts and the experts are missing. Which is that your children aren't broken. They're brilliant. They're just speaking a language nobody's bothered to learn. James felt something crack open in his chest, hope or terror, he couldn't tell which. What's in the folder? Maya opened it slowly, revealing photographs that made his breath catch. Pictures of his children, taken from a distance but with startling clarity. Emma arranging flowers in the building's courtyard in complex mathematical patterns. Alex creating elaborate sculptures from playground sand that followed principles of structural engineering. Ben communicating with pigeons using what looked like a systematic pattern of gestures. When did you take these? James whispered. Over the past month. Your children spend time on the roof garden every afternoon between 3 and 4 p.m., while you're on conference calls. They think no one is watching, so they let their real selves emerge. James stared at the photographs, seeing his children in a way he'd never noticed before. Emma's flower arrangements weren't random, they followed the Fibonacci sequence with architectural precision. Alex's sand structures weren't just playing, they were engineering marvels that demonstrated advanced spatial reasoning. Ben's gestures weren't meaningless, they were a complex communication system he developed with the building's wildlife. They're not just autistic, James, Maya said quietly. They're gifted. Profoundly gifted. But their brains work so differently from neurotypical children that every adult in their lives is focused on their deficits instead of their extraordinary abilities. How do you know so much about autism? Maya's expression shifted, pain flickering across her features like shadows passing over water. Because I've been where your children are. Because I understand what it's like to have a mind that works beautifully but differently, in a world that demands conformity. She pulled out another photograph, this one older, worn around the edges. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, sitting alone in what looked like a hospital room. The child's dark eyes held the same intensity James saw in his own children, the same mixture of intelligence and isolation. That's me at 7, in a psychiatric facility where my parents sent me because I couldn't stop organizing things by color and texture. Because I had meltdowns when my routines were disrupted. Because I communicated better with animals than people. Maya's voice stayed steady, but James caught the tremor beneath her words. I spent 3 years in institutions before a social worker named Dr. Elena Rodriguez recognized that I wasn't sick, I was different. She changed my life by seeing my autistic traits as gifts rather than symptoms. James felt his worldview tilting on its axis. You're autistic? I'm autistic. I have a master's degree in special education with a focus on twice exceptional children, kids who are both gifted and neurodivergent. I've spent the last 12 years working with families like yours, families that traditional caregivers and therapists have given up on. She pulled out a business card, simple white cardstock with elegant black lettering, Maya Santos, educational therapist and family advocate. Specializing in exceptional children. I don't understand, James said, sinking into the chair across from her. If you're qualified to help, why haven't you contacted me before? Why watch from a distance? Maya's eyes grew distant, and for a moment, James saw the little girl from the photograph. Brilliant, isolated, misunderstood. Because I've learned that families in crisis aren't ready to hear what I have to tell them until they've exhausted every other option. You needed to go through 11 failed caregivers. You needed to face the possibility of losing your children. You needed to be desperate enough to listen to someone who approaches autism completely differently than everyone else you've encountered. What do you mean differently? I mean I don't try to make autistic children act neurotypical. I don't use compliance-based therapies or focus on eliminating stymieing behaviors or forcing eye contact. Instead, I work with their natural neurological patterns. I build on their strengths. I teach families how to communicate in their children's native language instead of forcing the children to translate themselves into ours. James thought about the morning's chaos, Emma's headbanging, Alex's shutdown, Ben's retreat into silence. And you think this approach would work with my children? I don't think it would work, James. I know it would work. Because I've already started. The words hung between them like a challenge. What do you mean you've already started? Maya reached into her folder one final time, pulling out 3 hand-drawn pictures that made James's heart stop. Emma's careful artwork showing a woman with dark hair teaching her to use smooth stones instead of her fists when feelings got too big. Alex's precise drawing of the same woman showing him how to arrange blocks to spell words when talking felt impossible. Ben's detailed sketch of communication cards, pictures and symbols that could help him express needs without forcing speech. When did they draw these? James whispered. This morning, after the paramedics left. While you were at the hospital with Emma. I spent 2 hours with Alex and Ben. That's impossible. You weren't in my apartment. The building has security. Your children let me in, James. Alex opened the door when I knocked. Ben brought me Emma's art supplies. They've been watching me watch them for weeks, and they recognized me as someone who might understand their language. James felt the floor shifting beneath him. Everything he thought he knew about his children rearranging itself into new patterns. You were alone with my sons? For 2 hours. And in that time, Alex spoke to me using sign language he taught himself from library books. Ben showed me a detailed map he'd drawn of every sound in your apartment, marking which frequencies cause Emma distress. They're not just autistic, James. They're extraordinary problem solvers who've been developing coping strategies that no adult has bothered to notice. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to the intensity of a prayer. Your children don't need to be fixed. They need to be understood. They don't need to learn how to be normal. They need adults who are brave enough to learn how to be autistic. The lobby around them had gone completely quiet, as if the universe was holding its breath for James's response. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see parents walking with their children, couples holding hands, people living lives that seemed impossibly simple compared to his daily battles. What would you need from me? He asked finally. Permission to be their advocate instead of their caregiver. Permission to teach you their language instead of forcing them to speak yours. Permission to show the custody court that your children aren't failing, the system is failing them. James thought about Emma in her hospital bed, small and broken and surrounded by doctors who saw her behaviors as problems to be medicated rather than communications to be decoded. He thought about Alex and Ben upstairs, probably organizing something or creating something magnificent that adults would dismiss as obsessive behavior. He thought about Rebecca's parents and their lawyers, building a case that his children would be better off in a structured environment where their differences would be systematically erased. The custody hearing is in 3 days, he said. I know. And I have a plan. Maya stood, extending her hand to him with the formality of someone sealing a contract. The question isn't whether I can help your children, James. The question is whether you're ready to become the father they need instead of the father you think you should be. James looked at her outstretched hand, small, scarred from what looked like years of hard work, steady as stone. This woman claimed she could speak his children's language. She'd spent months observing his family, had somehow gained his son's trust in 2 hours, and was offering him something no one else had, hope. He took her hand. The moment their skin touched, James felt something electric pass between them, not romantic, but the recognition of 2 people who'd been carrying impossible burdens alone suddenly realizing they didn't have to anymore. When do we start? He asked. Maya's smile transformed her entire face, revealing the brilliant, determined child she'd once been. We already have. Your sons are waiting upstairs to show you what they've been trying to tell you all along. As they walked toward the elevator, James caught sight of his reflection in the lobby's mirrors. For the first time in 3 years, he looked like a man who believed his children had a future. The elevator doors closed behind them, carrying them toward a conversation that would either save his family or reveal just how much he'd been failing them all along. The penthouse apartment felt different when James walked in with Maya, quieter, but not the terrifying silence of children in hiding. This was the hushed anticipation of a theater audience waiting for the curtain to rise. Alex and Ben sat at the kitchen island, not cowering or stimmying, but working together on something that made James's breath catch in his throat. They'd built a three-dimensional map of Manhattan using every building block, Lego piece, and art supply in the apartment. But this wasn't child's play. This was architectural genius. The proportions were mathematically precise, the details impossibly accurate, and in the center of their creation was a perfect replica of their own building, complete with tiny figures that looked unmistakably like their family. "Holy shit," James whispered, then immediately covered his mouth. "Sorry, It's okay," Maya said softly. That's the appropriate response to witnessing brilliance. Alex looked up at his father with green eyes that held none of yesterday's fear. At 6 years old, he was small for his age, with delicate features and dark hair that refused to stay combed. His hands moved with the precision of a master craftsman as he adjusted a miniature traffic light to match the exact timing pattern of the intersection below their window. "Daddy," he said clearly, the first word he'd spoken directly to James in over a month, "we made the city so you could see how we see it." James felt his knees go weak. Alex's voice was soft but confident, each word carefully chosen and delivered with a deliberate cadence of someone translating complex thoughts into simple language. "Tell me about it," James managed, settling onto a stool across from his sons. Ben, quieter than his twin but equally intense, pointed to different sections of their creation with the careful precision of a tour guide. "The sounds are different in each block. Red buildings are too loud for Emma. Yellow buildings have good sounds, like humming or water. Green buildings are quiet enough for thinking." James stared at the color-coded cityscape, realizing his sons had created a sensory map of Manhattan that took into account noise pollution, traffic patterns, and acoustic environments. This wasn't just play, this was urban planning at a level that would impress graduate students. "Emma helped too," Alex added, adjusting a tiny figure near the replica hospital. "Before she got too upset this morning. She counted all the windows and made sure the math was right." "The math?" James asked. Maya knelt beside the boys, her voice full of the wonder of someone discovering buried treasure. "Show him Emma's calculations, Alex." Alex pulled out a sheet of paper covered in his sister's careful 6-year-old handwriting. Rows and columns of numbers that initially looked random resolved themselves into something extraordinary. Emma had calculated the window to wall ratios of every building visible from their apartment, then used those calculations to ensure their miniature city maintained perfect architectural proportions. "Emma sees patterns in everything," Ben explained, his voice barely above a whisper but growing stronger with each word. "Numbers, colors, shapes. She gets upset when the patterns are wrong because it hurts her brain." "Like this morning," James said, understanding flooding through him like sunlight after a storm. The broken coffee mug disrupted her pattern. "Not just the mug," Maya said gently. Mrs. Patterson rearranged the breakfast items. Emma had organized them by height and color, a system that helps her process the sensory overload of morning routines. When Mrs. Patterson moved everything to what she considered proper positions, it was like scrambling a complex equation Emma had been working on. James thought about the morning's chaos with new eyes. Emma's meltdown hadn't been a tantrum. It had been the neurological equivalent of watching someone destroy a mathematical proof she'd spent careful energy creating. "Why didn't anyone tell me this before?" he asked, his voice breaking with 3 years of accumulated guilt. "Because nobody was listening to what the children were actually communicating," Maya replied. "Traditional autism therapies focus on compliance, making autistic children appear neurotypical. But your children don't need to learn how to act normal. They need adults who understand that their behaviors are sophisticated communication systems." Alex carefully moved one of the tiny figures, the one representing Emma, from the hospital back to their building. "Emma comes home tomorrow?" "Yes," James said, watching his son's face light up with relief. "She comes home tomorrow. We made her a welcome-back present," Ben said, pointing to a section of their cityscape that James had initially overlooked. It was a perfect replica of Central Park, but with modifications, Sensory-friendly additions like quiet zones marked in blue, textured pathways indicated by different materials, and tiny figures engaged in activities that would appeal to different neurological needs. It's an autism-friendly park, Alex explained with a matter-of-fact tone of someone describing an obvious improvement. Emma could go there when regular parks are too loud. Ben could find quiet places to think. I could organize rocks by color and size without people telling me to stop. James felt tears threatening to spill over. His children hadn't just been surviving their autism. They'd been imagining a world where their neurological differences were accommodated rather than pathologized. They'd been designing solutions while the adults in their lives focused on problems. "Boys," Maya said softly, "would you like to show your father the communication boards you've been working on?" Alex and Ben exchanged a look that spoke volumes. The silent communication of twins who'd learned to rely on each other when the adult world felt incomprehensible. Together, they pulled out a collection of laminated cards that took James's breath away. The cards were beautifully crafted, each one featuring a hand-drawn picture with corresponding words in multiple languages: English, Spanish, and what looked like a symbol system the boys had created themselves. Happy, sad, overwhelmed, need space, want help, feeling creative, brain feels full, dozens of emotional and sensory states that most adults struggle to articulate, explained with the clarity of children who'd learned that communication was survival. Ben made these for when talking feels impossible, Alex explained. I helped with the organization system. Emma added the math. Each emotion has a number value so we can tell adults how big our feelings are. James picked up a card labeled Sensory Storm Level 8, that showed a child covering their ears while lightning bolts radiated from their head. The image was sophisticated enough to be used in psychology textbooks, but it had been created by 6-year-olds who needed a way to explain their internal experiences to adults who couldn't see beyond external behaviors. "How long have you been working on these?" James asked. "Since Mommy died," Ben whispered, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years of accumulated adaptation. We needed a way to tell the grown-ups what we needed when words felt too hard. The words hit James like a physical blow. While he'd been cycling through caregivers and therapists, his children had been developing their own therapeutic tools. While he'd been focusing on their deficits, they'd been creating sophisticated systems for self-advocacy and emotional regulation. If you're watching this and realizing you might have been missing something important about someone you love, take a moment to really see them. Sometimes the most beautiful communication happens in languages we haven't learned to speak yet. Drop a comment about a time someone surprised you with their hidden depths. "Maya," James said slowly, "how do I learn their language?" "The same way you'd learn any language," she replied, settling cross-legged on the floor beside the boy's cityscape. Immersion, respect, and the understanding that becoming fluent takes time, patience, and the willingness to make mistakes. She pulled out a notebook, worn leather, filled with what looked like months of careful observations. "I've been documenting your children's communication patterns, their sensory preferences, their creative expressions. Every behavior that teachers and therapists have labeled as problematic is actually sophisticated self-regulation or environmental adaptation." Alex moved closer to Maya, his trust evident in the way he leaned against her shoulder. "Maya sees our smart," he said simply. "You're smart." James repeated. "Our different kind of smart," Ben clarified. "The kind that makes grown-ups worried instead of proud." James felt something fundamental shift in his understanding, a tectonic plate of perception sliding into a new position. His children weren't failing at being neurotypical. They were succeeding at being themselves in a world that demanded they be someone else. "What do we do about the custody hearing?" he asked. Maya's expression grew fierce, protective. "We show the court what I'm showing you right now. We demonstrate that your children aren't problems to be managed. They're individuals to be celebrated. We prove that the only thing they need is adults brave enough to meet them where they are instead of demanding they come to us." The late afternoon sun streamed through the penthouse windows, casting golden light across the boys' architectural masterpiece. For the first time in 3 years, James's home felt peaceful. Not quiet, peaceful. The difference was everything. There's something else, Maya said, pulling out her phone. I recorded something this morning, after you left for the hospital. With the boys' permission. She pressed play, and James heard his son's voices as he'd never heard them before, confident, articulate, explaining their sister's meltdown with the clinical precision of trained observers. Emma wasn't being bad, Alex's recorded voice explained. Her nervous system got overwhelmed because the morning pattern was wrong. She needed deep pressure stimulation and a quiet space to reset, but Mrs. Patterson tried to talk to her when her brain couldn't process words. People think Emma is violent, Ben's voice added, but she's just trying to give herself the sensory input she needs to feel safe. Like when I rock or when Alex organizes things. It's not weird, it's necessary. James looked at his sons, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. Not as problems to be solved, but as remarkable human beings who developed extraordinary coping mechanisms for navigating a world not designed for their neurological patterns. They're not just autistic, he whispered. No, Maya agreed. They're autistic and brilliant and creative and resilient and everything you never allowed yourself to see because you were too focused on what they weren't. The elevator chimed. Emma was coming home from the hospital a day early. Through the intercom, James heard Rebecca the paramedic's voice. Mr. Mitchell, we have a very eager little girl who wants to see her family. Alex and Ben immediately began adjusting their cityscape, making space for their sister's return. Their movements were synchronized, purposeful, full of the kind of love that doesn't need words to be understood. As the apartment door opened and Emma's voice echoed through the hallway, bright, excited home, James realized he was about to meet his daughter for the first time too. The question was, would he be brave enough to see her as clearly as Maya and his sons already did? Emma burst through the apartment door like a small tornado of excitement and nervous energy, her hospital bracelet still around her tiny wrist and her dark curls escaping from the ponytail Rebecca had attempted in the car. At 6 years old, she was the smallest of the triplets but carried herself with the intense focus of someone much older, her green eyes scanning the apartment for changes with the precision of a security system. Alex. Ben, she called out, her voice pitched higher than usual, a sign of excitement mixed with anxiety that James was only now learning to recognize. I missed you so much my chest felt like it had butterflies and earthquakes at the same time. The twins rushed toward their sister with the synchronized movement of dancers who'd rehearsed this reunion 1,000 times in their minds. But instead of the chaotic collision James expected, they stopped just outside Emma's personal space bubble, waiting for her cue. Green light or red light, Emma? Alex asked gently, using terminology that clearly came from their own communication system. Emma considered this seriously, tilting her head like a scientist evaluating data. Yellow light. Hugs okay, but gentle ones. My skin still feels too awake from the hospital. The embrace that followed was beautiful in its careful choreography, 3 children who'd learned to love each other within the boundaries of sensory sensitivities and neurological differences. Ben offered pressure by leaning against Emma's back while Alex provided warmth from the front, creating a human sandwich that seemed to regulate all 3 nervous systems simultaneously. James watched this interaction with tears threatening to spill over. His children had developed their own system for physical affection that honored everyone's needs. How many times had he missed these sophisticated accommodations while focusing on their struggles? Daddy. Emma noticed him for the first time, her face lighting up with a pure joy that had become rare but never disappeared entirely. Guess what I learned at the hospital? She pulled out a small notebook, spiral-bound, filled with her careful handwriting and detailed drawings. I taught the nurses about sensory-friendly checkups. Look. The notebook contained what could only be described as a medical manual written by a 6-year-old genius. Emma had documented which medical procedures felt scary versus interesting, which rooms had good versus overwhelming lighting, and which nurses understood the difference between compliance and consent. This is Dr. Martinez, Emma said, pointing to a drawing of a smiling woman with long black hair. She learned that I need to hold my worry stone during blood pressure readings, and she explained everything before she did it so my brain could get ready. She said I should teach other doctors how to help autistic kids feel safe. Maya knelt down to Emma's level, but waited for the little girl to make eye contact first, another sign of her understanding that connection couldn't be forced, only invited. "Emma, this is Maya," James said. "She's the one who helped Alex and Ben build the city while you were gone." Emma studied Maya with the intensity of someone conducting a job interview. "Are you the lady who knows about different brains?" "I am," Maya said simply. "I have a different brain too. It works really well for understanding other people who think differently." "Show me," Emma said, the direct challenge of a child who'd been disappointed by adults too many times to trust easily. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out a small device that looked like a modified tablet. "This measures sound frequencies in real time. Want to see what your apartment sounds like to someone with auditory processing differences?" She turned on the device, and the screen filled with colorful waves that danced and spiked with every sound. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the building's heating system, even their own voices. To James, the apartment had seemed quiet. On Maya's device, it looked like a 4th of July fireworks display. "The yellow spikes are the refrigerator humming," Maya explained to Emma, who was staring at the screen with fascination. "The red ones are the elevator machinery. The orange waves are voices. See how they get bigger when we talk louder." Emma pointed to a cluster of jagged purple lines. "What are those scary ones?" "Construction equipment from the building across the street. That frequency range is especially challenging for people with auditory sensitivities." Emma's eyes widened with the recognition of someone finally seeing her world accurately reflected. "That's why mornings are hard. The construction starts at 7 a.m. and makes my brain feel like it's being scraped with forks." James felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Emma's morning meltdowns weren't random. They coincided exactly with construction noise that he couldn't even consciously hear, but that overwhelmed his daughter's more sensitive nervous system. "Emma," Maya continued, "Alex and Ben showed me the communication cards you helped create. They're brilliant. Would you like to add some to help adults understand sensory experiences?" Emma nodded eagerly, settling at the kitchen island where her brothers had left art supplies ready for her return. Within minutes, she was creating cards that would make occupational therapists weep with their accuracy. Sound overload, brain feel static, light too bright, eyes hurt inside, texture surprise, skin wants to run away. "Baby, why didn't you tell me about the construction noise?" James asked, sitting beside his daughter. Emma looked up from her artwork with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. "I did tell you, Daddy. I told you every morning when I covered my ears and asked if we could eat breakfast in the quiet room. But you said we needed to eat at the table like a normal family." The words hit James like a sledgehammer. How many times had Emma tried to communicate her needs in ways he simply hadn't recognized as communication? How many of her behavioral problems were actually sophisticated attempts at self-advocacy that he dismissed or redirected? "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with remorse. "I didn't understand what you were telling me." "It's okay," Emma said, patting his hand with a matter-of-fact kindness of someone who'd learned that adults needed forgiveness more often than children. "Maya says most grown-ups don't speak autistic yet, but they can learn if they want to." Rebecca appeared in the doorway, having stayed to ensure Emma's transition went smoothly. "How's our brilliant patient doing?" "I'm teaching Daddy about sound frequencies," Emma announced proudly. "Want to see?" Rebecca joined them at the kitchen island, her paramedic's uniform wrinkled from a long shift but her eyes bright with the affection of someone who'd watched this family struggle and was finally seeing hope. "Maya," Rebecca said quietly, "show them the video." Maya hesitated. "Are you sure it's time? They need to see what we're up against." Maya pulled out her phone with obvious reluctance. "James, I recorded this yesterday while observing your family from across the street. I need you to understand what Emma's custody evaluators saw versus what was actually happening." The video showed Emma during yesterday's meltdown, but from Maya's perspective across the street. Without sound, without context, it looked exactly like what the court-appointed psychologists would see, a child violently hitting her head while her father stood frozen and ineffective. "This is what will be presented as evidence of your failure as a parent," Maya said gently. A 6-year-old girl in crisis with no apparent intervention or support. James felt his stomach drop. "But you know what was really happening." "I know Emma was experiencing sensory overload from competing frequencies. I know you were following previous therapists' advice to avoid reinforcing negative behaviors by providing comfort during meltdowns. I know her headbanging was self-regulation, not self-harm. But the courts won't see any of that." Emma looked up from her communication cards, sensing the adult's tension. "Are the judges going to try to take us away from Daddy?" The direct question hung in the air like a sword suspended by thread. James looked at his daughter, this brilliant, sensitive, creative little girl who'd been trying so hard to communicate with a world that insisted on misunderstanding her. "Some people think you might be happier living with Grandma and Grandpa Eleanor," James said carefully. Emma's reaction was immediate and devastating. She dropped her art supplies and wrapped her arms around herself, beginning the gentle rocking motion that helped her nervous system regulate during stress. "No," she whispered, her voice carrying the terror of a child who'd learned that love wasn't always enough to keep families together. "No, Daddy. Grandma Eleanor says we're broken. She tries to make us stop being autistic. We can't stop being autistic, it's how our brains work." Alex and Ben immediately flanked their sister, not touching but creating a protective barrier with their presence. The three of them began humming together, a low, harmonious sound that seemed to resonate through the apartment like a meditation bell. James felt his heart shatter and rebuild simultaneously. His children weren't just siblings, they were a support system, a unit that had learned to regulate and protect each other when the adult world failed them. "Maya," he said quietly, "what do we need to do?" "We need to document everything," she replied, her voice carrying the steel of someone preparing for battle. Emma's medical advocacy at the hospital. Alex and Ben's architectural genius. Their communication systems. Their emotional intelligence. We need to show the court that these children aren't struggling despite being autistic. They're thriving because they're autistic. Rebecca checked her watch and sighed. "I have to get back to the ambulance, but Maya, show them the other thing. The thing that changes everything." Maya pulled out a thick folder labeled Wellington vs. Wellington, Custody Evaluation. James's blood ran cold as he recognized the official court documents. "How did you get that?" "Because," Maya said quietly, "I'm not just an educational therapist, James. I'm also a court-appointed special advocate for autistic children in custody disputes. And your case was assigned to me 3 weeks ago." The words hung in the air like a bomb with a lit fuse. Emma stopped humming. Alex and Ben stared at Maya with expressions James couldn't read. "You're working for the court?" James felt betrayed, angry, terrified. "This whole time, you've been evaluating us for them?" "No," Maya said firmly. "I've been building a case for you. For them. The court asked me to determine whether autistic children could thrive in their father's care or whether they needed the structured environment their paternal grandparents are promising to provide." She opened the folder, revealing dozens of photographs, detailed observations, and what looked like a comprehensive report. "My recommendation was due tomorrow," Maya continued. "But after spending 6 weeks observing your family, after seeing your children's remarkable adaptations and resilience, after witnessing their extraordinary bond with each other and their love for you despite everything, I've reached a conclusion." Emma climbed into James's lap, seeking comfort in the way she hadn't done since she was tiny. Alex and Ben moved closer, creating their protective formation around their father and sister. "What conclusion?" James whispered. Maya's smile was fierce, determined, full of the righteous anger of someone who'd spent her life fighting for misunderstood children. "That separating these children from their father would be the greatest tragedy I've ever had to document. and that anyone who thinks autistic children need to be fixed instead of celebrated has no business making decisions about their futures. But as Maya spoke, James noticed something that chilled him to the bone. Through the apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows, a black sedan was parked across the street. Two figures in dark suits were taking photographs with telephoto lenses. The custody battle wasn't waiting for court dates and official evaluations. It was already here. The black sedan had been parked across from the Mitchell building for 3 hours, its occupants taking photographs with the methodical precision of hunters tracking prey. James counted at least 2 figures inside, one with a telephoto lens trained on his apartment windows, another reviewing documents on a laptop that glowed blue in the evening shadows. "Maya," he said quietly, not wanting to alarm the children, "we have a problem." Maya followed his gaze to the street below, her expression hardening like steel cooling in water. "Eleanor's private investigators. I was wondering when they'd escalate to direct surveillance." "Private investigators?" James felt his blood pressure spike. What are they looking for? Evidence of neglect. Proof that autistic children can't thrive in an unstructured environment. Documentation of any behavior they can spin as dangerous or inappropriate. Maya's voice carried the weary tone of someone who'd fought this battle before. They want to catch your children being autistic on camera, then present it to the court as evidence of your failure as a parent. Emma looked up from her communication cards, her sensory-sensitive hearing picking up the tension in the adults' voices even when they whispered. "Are those the bad people who want to take us away?" James's first instinct was to lie, to protect his 6-year-old from adult fears. But Maya caught his eye and shook her head slightly, a reminder that these children had learned to navigate a hostile world by reading situations accurately. Lying would only undermine their trust. "Those are people working for Grandma and Grandpa Eleanor," James said carefully. "They're trying to take pictures that make our family look like we're not taking good care of each other." Alex stopped organizing his block collection and moved to the window, his mathematical mind immediately calculating angles and sight lines. "They can see into our living room from that position. Also the kitchen if we turn on the lights. The bedroom windows are blocked by the building's architecture." Ben joined his brother at the window, both boys studying the surveillance setup with the analytical focus of military strategists. "They have professional equipment. Telephoto lens, probably 200 millimeters minimum focal length. They're not amateur photographers." James stared at his 6-year-old sons, who were conducting a counter-surveillance assessment with casual expertise that would impress FBI agents. "How do you know about camera equipment?" "YouTube," Ben said matter-of-factly. "When people kept taking pictures of us during meltdowns, we researched photography so we'd understand what they were documenting and why." "We also learned about privacy laws," Alex added, his voice carrying an edge that James had never heard before. Maya pulled out her phone, speed-dialing a number with practiced efficiency. "David, it's Maya Santos. I need an emergency consultation on surveillance law." "Yes, tonight. The Mitchell custody case." While Maya spoke in rapid legal terminology, Emma climbed onto James's lap, her small body trembling with the anxiety that preceded sensory overload. "Daddy, I don't like people watching us. It makes my brain feel sparkly and wrong." "I know, baby," James said, rubbing her back in the firm, rhythmic pattern he'd learned helped regulate her nervous system. "Maya's going to help us make it stop." Rebecca, who had been quietly observing from the kitchen, stepped forward with the practical authority of someone accustomed to crisis management. "James, you need to close all the curtains and blinds immediately." "Maya, what's the legal timeline on this?" "The custody hearing is in 48 hours, Maya replied, ending her call. David confirms that private investigators hired by opposing parties in custody cases have broader surveillance privileges, but there are still limits. They can't use telephoto lenses to photograph inside private residences, and they can't document medical information without court orders. Emma's trembling intensified. Medical information? Maya knelt beside James's chair, her voice gentle but urgent. Emma, remember yesterday when you had the sensory overload? If they photograph you during a meltdown without understanding what's really happening, they might tell the judge that you're dangerous to yourself. But I'm not dangerous, Emma whispered, her voice breaking. I just get overwhelmed sometimes and need help getting calm again. We know that, sweetheart, James said, feeling helpless rage burn in his chest. But sometimes grown-ups don't understand the difference. Alex and Ben had moved away from the window and were huddled together near their architectural cityscape, speaking in the low, rapid tones they used when developing complex plans. James caught fragments of their conversation: documentation, counter-evidence, protecting Emma. Boys, what are you thinking? Maya asked, recognizing the signs of brilliant minds solving problems. Alex looked up with a serious expression of someone twice his age. If they want to document our behaviors to prove we're problematic, we should document our behaviors to prove we're not. You want to film yourselves? James asked. We want to create a video that shows what our autism actually looks like versus what people think it looks like, Ben clarified. Like Emma's meltdown yesterday, if we record ourselves explaining what's happening while it's happening, the judges will understand it's communication, not violence. Maya's eyes lit up with a recognition of strategic genius. That's actually brilliant. A preemptive documentary created by autistic children themselves, explaining their own experiences. Emma perked up, her anxiety transforming into excitement. We could show them our communication cards. And the city we built. And how Alex's organizing helps his brain feel safe. And how Ben's quietness isn't being antisocial, it's conserving energy for important conversations, Alex added. Rebecca checked her watch and frowned. The surveillance team is changing shifts. New car, different people. This isn't casual documentation, it's coordinated. Through the apartment's intercom, Tony the doorman's voice crackled with urgency. Mr. Mitchell, you need to know, there have been people asking questions about your family. Child services investigators, lawyers, even someone claiming to be from your children's school. I didn't give them any information, but they're building some kind of case. James felt the walls closing in around his family. Eleanor and her husband Richard weren't just preparing for a custody hearing. They were constructing a comprehensive assault on his fitness as a parent. Maya, what's Eleanor's endgame here? He asked. Maya's expression grew grim. Complete custody transfer. They're arguing that autistic children require specialized care that only a traditional two-parent household with adequate resources can provide. They want to place your children in ABA therapy programs designed to eliminate autistic behaviors entirely. Eliminate autistic behaviors? Emma's voice rose with alarm. But being autistic is how we think. How we see patterns and solve problems and love each other. ABA therapy focuses on compliance training, Maya explained gently. Making autistic children appear neurotypical through intensive behavioral modification. For children like you three, who are brilliant precisely because of how your autistic minds work, it would be devastating. The apartment fell silent except for the distant hum of the city and the soft clicking sounds Alex made when he was thinking intensely. Finally, Emma stood up on James's lap with a determined expression of someone making a life-changing decision. Then we make our movie tonight, she announced. Before they can show the judges pictures that make us look broken, we show them the truth about how beautiful our brains are. Alex and Ben immediately began organizing supplies, cameras, art materials, their communication cards, the architectural cityscape that demonstrated their extraordinary abilities. The transformation was remarkable, 3 children who'd been cowering from surveillance suddenly becoming fierce advocates for their own humanity. Have you ever watched someone discover their own power in the face of injustice? It's one of the most beautiful and terrifying things in the world. Share a moment when you or someone you love found courage they didn't know they had. I'd love to hear your stories. James, Maya said quietly, pulling him aside while the children planned their documentary. There's something else you need to know. The surveillance isn't just about documentation. Eleanor's team is looking for legal justification to request emergency custody removal before the hearing. What would give them that justification? Any incident they can classify as endangerment. A meltdown that results in injury. A situation where you appear unable to manage their needs. Any evidence that the children are at immediate risk in your care. James looked at his children, who were creating something beautiful and powerful in response to the threat against their family. Emma was drawing storyboard panels with artistic skill that belied her age. Alex was calculating optimal camera angles using geometric principles. Ben was writing script notes that captured complex emotional concepts in simple, clear language. "They're not at risk," he said firmly. "Look at them, Maya. They're thriving." "I know. You know. But if Eleanor's investigators can manufacture a crisis and document your response, they can convince a judge that immediate intervention is necessary." As if summoned by their conversation, James's phone rang. The caller ID showed Eleanor Wellington's number, and he knew with absolute certainty that this call would change everything. "James," Eleanor's voice was silk wrapped around steel, "we need to talk. Tonight. About the children's future and what's best for everyone involved." Through the window, the surveillance team adjusted their equipment, cameras trained on the apartment like weapons preparing to fire. The battle for his family was about to begin in earnest, and James realized that everything, their home, their happiness, their very identity as a family, hung in the balance of the next 24 hours. James stared at Eleanor's name on his phone screen, his finger hovering over the decline button like it was a trigger that could save or damn his family. The surveillance team across the street had positioned additional equipment. He could see the glint of a second telephoto lens and what looked like audio recording devices aimed at his windows. "Don't answer," Maya said quietly. "Not yet. She's calling because her team is in position to document whatever reaction she can provoke." "But if I don't?" "Daddy," Emma interrupted, her 6-year-old voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned to read adult emotions as a survival skill, "the phone is making your face look scared. Can you put it away so we can make our movie?" James looked at his daughter, this brilliant, sensitive little girl who was choosing creativity over fear in the face of people trying to tear their family apart, and felt something fierce and protective surge through his chest. He turned off his phone. "You're right, baby. Let's make our movie." The apartment transformed into a film studio as the children organized their documentary project with the efficiency of seasoned professionals. Alex had calculated optimal lighting angles using the evening sun streaming through west-facing windows. Ben had written a script that broke down complex autism concepts into language even hostile judges could understand. Emma had created visual aids that were simultaneously childlike and sophisticated, drawings that captured the beauty of neurodivergent thinking with artistic clarity. "We start with introductions," Emma announced, positioning herself in front of Alex's calculated camera angle. Her dark curls caught the golden light, and her green eyes sparkled with determination that made James's heart ache with pride. "My name is Emma Mitchell, and I'm 6 years old and autistic and really good at seeing patterns that help solve problems." Alex stepped into frame beside his sister, his smaller stature and quiet intensity creating a perfect contrast. "I'm Alex Mitchell. I'm also 6 and autistic. I organize things because it helps my brain feel calm, and when my brain feels calm, I can think about really complicated math." Ben joined them, his presence completing the trio like the final note of a chord. "I'm Ben Mitchell. Being autistic means I think differently, not wrong. Sometimes I don't talk because I'm saving my words for important things." Maya operated James's phone camera with professional skill, capturing angles that showcased the children's intelligence and emotional maturity. Rebecca had stayed to help, using her medical knowledge to explain the neurological basis of their behaviors in terms that would counter any attempts to pathologize them. "Emma," Maya said gently, "can you show us what a sensory overload feels like and how you cope with it?" Emma nodded seriously, moving to her communication cards. Sometimes the world feels too big and too loud and too bright all at the same time. Like this morning when Mrs. Patterson moved my breakfast pattern and the construction noise started and my brain couldn't organize all the information. She held up one of her hand-drawn cards, Sensory Storm Level 8, and explained with clinical precision that would impress occupational therapists. When this happens, my body tries to help by giving me deep pressure. If I hit my head against something, it's not because I want to hurt myself. It's because my nervous system needs input to reset. What helps you feel better? Maya asked. Emma retrieved her collection of smooth stones, weighted blanket, and noise-canceling headphones. These things give my brain the right kind of information. Daddy learned to help me by being quiet and calm until the storm passes. Alex demonstrated his organizational systems, explaining how arranging objects by color, size, and texture wasn't obsessive behavior, but rather a sophisticated method of environmental management that reduced anxiety and increased focus. When everything in my space has a pattern, he said, carefully arranging blocks in complex mathematical sequences, my brain can relax and think about interesting things instead of worrying about chaos. Ben showed his communication cards and explained selective mutism with the patience of a teacher addressing students who'd never encountered the concept before. Not talking doesn't mean I don't have thoughts or feelings, he said, his soft voice carrying absolute conviction. It means I'm being careful about when and how I share them. Like right now, talking to this camera is important, so I'm using my words to protect my family. The children worked for 2 hours, creating segments that covered their daily routines, their coping strategies, their creative projects, and most importantly, their deep love for each other and their father. They demonstrated their architectural cityscape, explained their sensory mapping techniques, and showed their emotional regulation tools with the confidence of experts sharing their specialized knowledge. James watched his children transform from victims of misunderstanding into advocates for their own humanity, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what it meant to be their father. They didn't need him to fix them or protect them from their autism. They needed him to support their brilliance and defend their right to exist authentically in the world. "Dad," Alex said during a break between filming segments, "can you be in our movie too?" "Me? I don't know what I'd say." "Tell them about before Maya came," Emma suggested. "Tell them how scared you were that we were broken, and how you learned we were just different." Ben nodded agreement. "Tell them about the morning meltdown, but from your perspective. So they understand that good dads can be confused about autism and still love their kids." James found himself in front of the camera, looking into his phone's lens as if it were a mirror reflecting 3 years of accumulated guilt and newfound hope. "My name is James Mitchell," he began, his voice rough with emotion. 3 years ago, my wife died giving birth to these 3 extraordinary children. I spent every day since then trying to figure out how to be the father they needed, and I made a lot of mistakes because I was focused on what they couldn't do instead of celebrating what they could do. He looked at his children, who were watching him with expressions of love and forgiveness that made his throat constrict. "I thought autism was something that happened to them, something that made their lives harder. Maya taught me that autism is something they are, something that makes their minds work in beautiful and powerful ways." "What would you want judges to know about autistic children?" Maya asked from behind the camera. James thought about Emma's mathematical flower arrangements, Alex's architectural genius, Ben's sophisticated communication systems. That they're not problems to be solved. They're people to be understood. That their behaviors aren't symptoms to be eliminated. They're adaptations to be respected. That any adult who thinks these children need to be fixed doesn't understand the first thing about what makes them magnificent. As they finished filming, James's phone buzzed with missed calls, 17 from Eleanor, 12 from unknown numbers that were probably her legal team. The surveillance across the street had intensified, with additional vehicles and equipment that suggested tomorrow's custody hearing had expanded into something much larger. Maya reviewed their footage with the satisfaction of someone who just documented a masterpiece. "This is powerful. This shows 3 autistic children and their father as they really are, brilliant, loving, resilient, and thriving together." Will it be enough? James asked. Before Maya could answer, the apartment's intercom crackled with an urgency that made everyone freeze. Mr. Mitchell, Tony's voice was tight with alarm. There are people here with legal documents. They say they have authority to conduct an emergency welfare check on your children. They're coming up now. Rebecca checked her watch. 9:47 p.m. Welfare checks don't happen this late unless there's been a report of immediate danger. Maya's face went pale. They manufactured a crisis. Eleanor's team called in a false report to force an emergency intervention before the hearing. The elevator chimed. Footsteps approached their door. Official voices consulted legal documents in the hallway. Emma climbed into James's lap, her small body trembling. Daddy, are they going to take us away tonight? Alex and Ben flanked their father's chair, creating their protective formation while clutching the communication cards that proved their emotional sophistication. A sharp knock echoed through the apartment like gunshots. Child Protective Services, a woman's voice announced. We need to speak with James Mitchell and conduct a welfare assessment of the minor children in this residence. James looked at his children, these remarkable, brilliant, autistic kids who'd spent the evening creating a documentary about their own humanity, and realized that all their preparation, all their truth-telling, all their love might not be enough to prevent the system from tearing them apart. The knock came again, more insistent. The surveillance team across the street had their cameras ready. And in 47 hours, a judge would decide whether this family deserved to stay together or whether autism was grounds for destruction. Mr. Mitchell, please open the door. James stood up, his children gathered around him like small warriors preparing for the battle of their lives. It was time to find out if the truth was powerful enough to overcome prejudice, if love was stronger than legal manipulation, and if 3 6-year-old children could save their family by simply being themselves. James opened the door to find 3 people in the hallway, a stern-faced woman in her 50s holding official documents, a younger man with a briefcase who looked like a lawyer, and a uniformed police officer whose presence made the children instinctively move closer to their father. Mr. Mitchell, I'm Sandra Hayes from Child Protective Services, the woman announced, her voice carrying the bureaucratic authority of someone accustomed to entering homes uninvited. We've received reports of potential endangerment regarding the minor children in this residence. We need to conduct an immediate welfare assessment. What kind of reports? James asked, though his sinking stomach already knew the answer. The lawyer, mid-30s with sharp eyes and expensive clothes that screamed private practice, stepped forward with predatory confidence. Mr. Mitchell, I'm David Goldman, representing the children's paternal grandparents. We have documentation of incidents suggesting these children may be at risk due to their father's inability to manage their specialized medical needs. Maya appeared beside James with the calm presence of someone who'd navigated these waters before. I'm Maya Santos, court-appointed special advocate for the children. May I see your documentation? Sandra Hayes handed over a thick folder that made James's blood run cold. The top page showed a photograph, Emma during yesterday's meltdown, taken from the street with a telephoto lens, showing her hitting her head while James stood frozen in the background. Without context, it looked exactly like child abuse by neglect. This image was taken yesterday morning during what witnesses described as a violent episode, Goldman explained with clinical detachment. The father made no attempt to intervene or provide assistance while his daughter engaged in self-harming behavior. Emma, who had been hiding behind James's legs, suddenly stepped forward with the fearless dignity of someone defending her family's honor. That's not what happened, she said clearly, her 6-year-old voice cutting through the adult's legal rhetoric like a blade. I was having a sensory overload and Daddy was getting my weighted blanket to help me feel better. Sandra Hayes looked down at Emma with the patronizing expression of someone accustomed to dismissing children's perspectives. Sweetheart, we need to talk to the grown-ups right now. But I'm the one in the picture, Emma replied with devastating logic. Shouldn't you ask me what was happening inside my body? Alex and Ben flanked their sister, creating their protective triangle formation. Alex held up one of their communication cards, Sensory Storm Level 8, with the confidence of someone presenting scientific evidence. "This is what Emma was experiencing," Alex explained with the patient tone of a teacher addressing slow students. "Sensory overload isn't violence. It's neurology." Ben added quietly but firmly, and Daddy wasn't ignoring Emma. He was following the best practice protocol for supporting someone during sensory overwhelm. Sandra Hayes blinked, clearly unprepared for such articulate responses from 6-year-olds. "Children, please go to your rooms while we discuss." "No," all 3 children said simultaneously, their voices harmonizing with the unity of people who'd learned to stand together against misunderstanding. Maya stepped forward with the authority of someone who understood both autism and law. "Ms. Hayes, these children have the right to advocate for themselves, especially given that this assessment directly impacts their welfare. I'd like to show you something before you proceed." She pulled out James's phone, which still contained their documentary footage. The children spent this evening creating a video that explains their autism from their own perspectives. Given that this assessment centers on autism-related behaviors, their testimony is not only relevant, it's essential. Goldman attempted to object. "Child testimony in welfare assessments requires specific protocols, which I'm qualified to supervise," Maya interrupted smoothly. "As their court-appointed advocate and a licensed educational therapist specializing in autistic children." Sandra Hayes looked uncertain, caught between legal pressure and the unexpected reality of 3 highly articulate children who clearly weren't the helpless victims her documentation suggested. "5 minutes, she said finally. "Show me this video." Maya started the footage on James's phone, and the apartment filled with Emma's confident voice. "My name is Emma Mitchell, and I'm 6 years old and autistic and really good at seeing patterns that help solve problems." As the video played, Sandra Hayes' expression shifted from skepticism to surprise to something approaching wonder. The children on screen weren't damaged or dangerous. They were brilliant, self-aware, and deeply connected to each other and their father. When Alex explained his organizational systems, Hayes found herself leaning forward with genuine interest. When Ben described selective mutism as conservation of energy for important communications, she nodded with understanding. When Emma demonstrated her sensory regulation tools, Hayes began asking questions that showed she was finally listening rather than just documenting. "The meltdown in the photograph," Hayes said slowly. "You're saying it was a neurological response to environmental overwhelm?" "Exactly," Emma replied. "And Daddy knew that trying to talk to me or touch me during a sensory storm would make it worse, so he was being a good dad by giving me space and getting the tools I needed to feel safe again." The police officer, who had been silent throughout the assessment, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I've been to a lot of domestic disturbance calls. This isn't what child endangerment looks like." Goldman's confident demeanor was beginning to crack. "Officer, your opinion isn't relevant to the legal." "Actually, it is," Maya interjected. "Officer Martinez has specialized training in autism response protocols. Don't you, officer?" Officer Martinez nodded. "My nephew is autistic. I've seen real sensory meltdowns and I've seen behavioral problems. These are completely different things." Sandra Hayes reviewed the surveillance photographs again, but now with the children's explanations providing context. Emma's headbanging transformed from self-harm to self-regulation. Alex's obsessive organizing became sophisticated environmental management. Ben's concerning silence revealed itself as thoughtful communication conservation. "Mr. Mitchell," Hayes said finally, "I need to ask you directly, do you believe you're adequately equipped to care for 3 autistic children?" James looked at his children, these remarkable individuals who just advocated for themselves with more sophistication than most adults could manage, and felt his answer rise from the deepest place in his heart. 6 hours ago, I would have said no," he admitted. "I would have told you that I was failing them every day, that I didn't understand their needs, that maybe they would be better off with people who knew how to help them." Emma took his hand, her small fingers squeezing with reassurance that made his throat tighten. But today I learned that I wasn't failing them because they were broken, James continued, his voice growing stronger. I was failing them because I was trying to fix something that was never broken in the first place. These children don't need to be cared for. They need to be understood, supported, and celebrated for exactly who they are. Sandra Hayes looked around the apartment, taking in the architectural cityscape, the sensory tools, the communication cards, the evidence of a family that had learned to accommodate and celebrate neurodivergence rather than eliminate it. The emergency reports cited ongoing behavioral incidents and parental inability to manage specialized needs, she said slowly. I'm not seeing evidence of either concern. Goldman stepped forward desperately. Ms. Hayes, the grandparents are prepared to provide a structured therapeutic environment with professional ABA services. No. Emma's voice cracked like a whip, surprising everyone with its fierce intensity. ABA therapy tries to make autistic kids stop being autistic. It's like trying to make Alex stop being good at math or Ben stop being thoughtful or me stop seeing patterns. ABA compliance training would be devastating for children with their level of intelligence and self-awareness, Maya added with clinical authority. It would essentially train them to mask their authentic selves, leading to anxiety, depression, and loss of the very cognitive abilities that make them extraordinary. Sandra Hayes closed her file folder with a decisive snap that echoed through the apartment like a gavel falling. Mr. Mitchell, based on my assessment, I see no evidence of endangerment or neglect. These children are clearly thriving under your care, and they've demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence and self-advocacy skills that suggest a supportive, understanding environment. Goldman's face went white. Ms. Hayes, I must protest. You may protest to the family court tomorrow, Hayes replied firmly. But as far as emergency intervention goes, it's not warranted. These children are safe, loved, and extraordinarily well cared for. As the CPS team prepared to leave, Emma tugged on Sandra Hayes' sleeve with the persistence of someone who had one more important thing to say. Ms. Hayes, Emma said seriously, can you tell other people who work with autistic kids that we're not broken? That we just think differently? That being different can be really, really beautiful. Sandra Hayes knelt down to Emma's level, her stern professional facade cracking to reveal genuine emotion. I will, sweetheart. I promise I will. After the officials left, the apartment fell into the exhausted quiet of people who just survived a battle. But as James looked at his children, his brilliant, resilient, autistic children who'd just saved their own family, he realized the war wasn't over. Tomorrow's custody hearing would determine everything. And Eleanor Wellington was undoubtedly preparing her final assault. The courthouse steps at 8 a.m. looked like a battlefield dressed in marble and granite. Eleanor Wellington stood at the center of an army of legal professionals, 3 lawyers in $1,000 suits, 2 child psychologists with briefcases full of diagnostic manuals, and a stenographer who'd probably documented more family destructions than reunions. Eleanor herself was a study in calculated perfection, silver hair styled in an immaculate bob, navy Chanel suit that cost more than most people's rent, and cold blue eyes that had never learned to see autism as anything other than a family embarrassment to be hidden or cured. James, she called out as he approached with Maya and the children, her voice carrying across the courthouse plaza like a blade wrapped in silk. We need to talk before this hearing begins. Privately. James felt his children instinctively cluster closer to him, Emma gripping his hand with fierce determination, Alex and Ben flanking him like small bodyguards who'd learned that love meant protection. They'd spent the night practicing their testimony, preparing for questions that might confuse or upset them, but now, faced with Eleanor's intimidating legal army, they looked like what they were, 3 6-year-old children fighting for their right to stay with their father. Anything you have to say can be said in front of Maya and the kids, James replied, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. Eleanor's smile was arctic. Very well. I'm prepared to offer you a compromise that might save everyone considerable pain. She gestured to one of her lawyers, who stepped forward with documents that looked official enough to change lives. Voluntary relinquishment of custody to the grandparents, with guaranteed visitation rights every other weekend and major holidays. The children would receive the best private education, intensive autism therapy, and the structured applied behavior analysis with board-certified practitioners, Eleanor replied proudly. 40 hours per week of intensive intervention designed to help them overcome their limitations and integrate into mainstream society. Emma's sharp intake of breath was audible across the plaza. 40 hours? That's more than Daddy works. It's not therapy, Alex said quietly, his mathematical mind calculating the implications. It's training. Like teaching animals to perform tricks. Ben, usually the quietest of the three, stepped forward with surprising boldness. Grandma Eleanor, why do you want us to stop being autistic? Being autistic is what makes us good at the things we're good at. Eleanor's composure cracked slightly, revealing the disgust she'd been hiding behind grandmother concern. Benjamin, autism isn't something to be proud of. It's a disorder that limits your potential. With proper treatment, you could learn to behave like normal children. But we don't want to be normal, Emma said with the devastating honesty of someone who'd never learned to lie about essential truths. Normal sounds boring. And lonely. And like we'd have to pretend to be someone else every day. Maya stepped protectively closer to the children, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent her life fighting these battles. Mrs. Wellington, what you're describing isn't therapy, it's conversion practice. The goal of ABA compliance training is to make autistic children indistinguishable from neurotypical children, regardless of the psychological cost. The psychological cost? Eleanor's laugh was brittle as winter ice. The psychological cost is 3 children who will never be able to function independently, never hold jobs, never have meaningful relationships. The psychological cost is a family legacy destroyed by a father too weak to do what's necessary. James felt something ignite in his chest, not anger, but clarity so fierce it burned away 3 years of doubt and guilt. Eleanor, the only thing that's been destroyed here is your ability to see these children as they actually are. He knelt down to his children's level, speaking directly to them while Eleanor's legal team documented every word for use in court. Emma, tell Grandma Eleanor about the architectural project you completed yesterday. Emma's face lit up with pride that no amount of legal intimidation could dim. I calculated the mathematical relationships between building heights and window patterns across 17 city blocks, then used those calculations to create a scale model that demonstrates urban planning principles. Alex, tell her about your organizational system. I developed a multivariable classification system that sorts objects by color, texture, size, and function simultaneously, Alex explained with the confidence of someone discussing a Nobel Prize-worthy discovery. It's not obsessive behavior, it's advanced pattern recognition that helps me process complex environmental information. Ben, tell her about your communication innovations. Ben pulled out their homemade communication cards with hands that no longer shook. I created a symbolic language system that allows nonverbal communication during sensory overload or emotional overwhelm. It's more efficient than spoken language and reduces the energy cost of social interaction. Eleanor stared at her grandchildren as if seeing them for the first time, but her expression shifted from surprise to something harder, more determined. Parlor tricks, she said dismissively. Savant behaviors that will become obsessions without proper intervention. Mrs. Wellington, Maya said quietly, your grandchildren just described abilities that most graduate students in mathematics, urban planning, and linguistics would envy. And you're calling them parlor tricks. Eleanor's final mask slipped away, revealing the truth that had been driving her crusade all along. I will not have the Wellington name associated with mental deficiency. I will not watch my daughter's children become social outcasts because their father lacks the backbone to provide proper treatment. Mental deficiency? James stood slowly, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that made even Eleanor's lawyers step back. You think our children are mentally deficient? Look at them, James. Eleanor's voice rose to near shouting, her careful composure completely abandoned. They can't make eye contact. They have meltdowns in public. They arrange toys instead of playing with them. They're 6 years old and they act like little robots programmed by someone who doesn't understand normal human behavior. The courthouse plaza had gone silent, passers-by stopping to witness what was clearly a family in crisis. But instead of the shame James might have felt months earlier, he felt only protective fury and crystal-clear purpose. "You're right, Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying across the plaza like a bell. "They are different from other children." Emma sees mathematical patterns that could revolutionize architecture. Alex understands organizational systems that could improve urban planning. Ben communicates with an efficiency and thoughtfulness that most adults never achieve. He moved to stand behind his children, his hands on their shoulders. They don't make forced eye contact because they've learned that meaningful connection doesn't require neurotypical social performance. They arrange objects instead of playing randomly because their minds work systematically and beautifully. And yes, they have meltdowns when overwhelmed because they're human beings with sensitive nervous systems, not robots programmed to perform normalcy. Eleanor's face had gone white with fury. "You're delusional if you think any judge will award custody to someone who celebrates mental illness. And you're about to discover that some judges understand the difference between mental illness and neurological diversity," Maya said with quiet satisfaction. "Especially when the evidence shows 3 extraordinary children thriving under their father's care." As if summoned by their conversation, a court clerk appeared on the courthouse steps. "Wellington versus Mitchell custody hearing. Courtroom 4B. All parties please report for preliminary proceedings." Eleanor's legal team assembled around her like armor, but James noticed something that gave him hope, doubt flickering in the lawyer's eyes as they'd listened to the children speak. Professional attorneys who'd expected to represent clear-cut cases of parental failure, now facing 3 articulate, obviously intelligent kids who spoke about their autism with pride rather than shame. As they climbed the courthouse steps, Emma slipped her hand into James's and whispered, "Daddy, are you scared?" James looked down at his daughter, this brilliant, autistic, extraordinary little girl who'd taught him that love meant acceptance rather than fixing, and realized that for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't scared at all. "No, baby," he said. "I'm ready." Because whatever happened in that courtroom, he finally understood what Rebecca had died trying to give their children, a father who saw them as perfect exactly the way they were. The massive wooden doors of Courtroom 4B opened before them like gates to their future. In 30 minutes, a judge would decide whether being autistic was grounds for family destruction or family celebration. And 3 6-year-old children were about to teach an entire legal system what it meant to be beautifully, brilliantly, authentically themselves. Judge Maria Santos entered Courtroom 4B with the measured dignity of someone who'd spent 20 years making decisions that shaped children's lives. At 58, she carried herself with the authority of experience tempered by compassion, her dark eyes taking in the assembled parties with a careful assessment of someone who understood that legal precedents meant nothing if they destroyed families. "Be seated," she said, her voice carrying the quiet power that made even Eleanor's legal army settle into respectful attention. "This is a custody determination hearing for minor children Emma, Alexander, and Benjamin Mitchell. Before we begin formal proceedings, I want to establish something clearly." She looked directly at the 3 children, who sat between James and Maya with the composed attention of students in an important class. "Emma, Alex, Ben, this court recognizes that you are the most important people in this room today. Any decisions made here will be made with your best interests as the primary consideration. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Emma said clearly, her 6-year-old voice carrying across the courtroom with startling confidence. "We understand that you have to decide if being autistic means we can't live with our daddy anymore." A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. Judge Santos leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting to one of genuine interest. "Is that how you see this hearing, Emma?" "Yes, ma'am. Grandma Eleanor thinks autism is broken and needs to be fixed. Daddy and Maya learned that autism is different and should be celebrated. You have to decide who's right." Judge Santos made a note, then addressed Eleanor's lead attorney. "Mr. Goldman, please present your opening statement." Goldman rose with the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to winning custody cases through superior resources and legal intimidation. Your Honor, the petitioners seek emergency custody transfer based on clear evidence of the respondent father's inability to manage the specialized medical and behavioral needs of 3 severely autistic children. He gestured to his briefcase full of documentation. We have medical records showing repeated emergency interventions, documentation of behavioral incidents requiring paramedic response, and expert testimony confirming that these children require intensive therapeutic intervention that only a structured residential environment can provide. Maya rose for the defense, her presence commanding despite her modest appearance. Your Honor, I'm Maya Santos, court-appointed special advocate for the children. The defense will demonstrate that the petitioners have fundamentally misunderstood both autism and these particular children's extraordinary capabilities. What they're calling severe dysfunction is actually evidence of remarkable intelligence adapting to an environment that doesn't accommodate neurological differences. Judge Santos nodded. Mr. Goldman, present your evidence. Goldman's first exhibit was the surveillance photograph, Emma during her meltdown, hitting her head while James stood frozen in the background. Projected on the courtroom screen, it looked damning. A small child in apparent distress with no parental intervention. This image captures the respondent's typical response to his daughter's violent episodes, Goldman explained. Complete inaction while a 6-year-old child engages in self-injurious behavior. Objection, Maya said calmly. That characterization assumes facts not in evidence and misrepresents the nature of autistic sensory regulation. Sustained. Judge Santos ruled. Mr. Goldman, please limit yourself to describing what the photograph shows, not interpreting behaviors you may not understand. Goldman presented additional evidence, medical records from emergency room visits, reports from failed caregivers, documentation of behavioral incidents that painted a picture of a family in constant crisis. The children require 40 hours per week of applied behavior analysis therapy, Goldman concluded. Intensive intervention designed to teach appropriate social behaviors and eliminate harmful stemming and obsessive behaviors. Only the structured environment proposed by the grandparents can provide this level of care. When Goldman finished, Judge Santos turned to Maya. Ms. Santos, your response? Maya stood with the quiet confidence of someone about to reveal a truth that would change everything. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence created by the children themselves. She moved to the courtroom's audiovisual system and loaded the documentary footage Emma, Alex, and Ben had created the night before. This video was made yesterday evening by 3 autistic children who wanted to explain their experiences in their own words. Emma's voice filled the courtroom. My name is Emma Mitchell, and I'm 6 years old and autistic and really good at seeing patterns that help solve problems. The effect was electric. Judge Santos leaned forward with obvious interest as the children on screen demonstrated abilities that contradicted every negative assumption in Goldman's presentation. Emma's mathematical calculations, Alex's architectural genius, Ben's sophisticated communication systems, all presented with the clear articulation of individuals who understood themselves completely. Your Honor, Maya said as the video concluded, these children don't need to be fixed. They need to be understood. She called her first witness, Dr. Rebecca Santos, the paramedic who'd responded to the family's emergency calls. Dr. Santos, in your professional opinion, were the medical interventions for Emma Mitchell the result of parental neglect? Rebecca's voice was steady, professional. Absolutely not. Emma's sensory overloads required medical support because her nervous system was overwhelmed, not because her father failed to provide care. Mr. Mitchell followed appropriate protocols for supporting someone during sensory crisis. What protocols? Avoiding physical contact that could increase overwhelm, providing deep pressure tools like weighted blankets, creating quiet environments for nervous system regulation. Mr. Mitchell's responses were textbook examples of trauma-informed autism support. Goldman's cross-examination was brutal. Dr. Santos, isn't it true that your sister is the defendant's advocate? Doesn't this create a conflict of interest? My sister is Maya Santos, yes. But my medical assessment is based on professional protocols, not family relationships. I've responded to hundreds of autism-related emergency calls. The Mitchell family situation was never about neglect. It was about a father learning to support children with complex neurological needs. Maya's next witness was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a renowned autism researcher who testified via video link. Dr. Rodriguez, in your expert opinion, would intensive ABA therapy benefit children with the cognitive profiles demonstrated by Emma, Alex, and Ben Mitchell? Dr. Rodriguez's response was unequivocal. It would be devastating. These children demonstrate exceptional intelligence, creativity, and self-advocacy skills. ABA compliance training would essentially teach them to mask their authentic selves, leading to anxiety, depression, and suppression of the very cognitive abilities that make them extraordinary. But Maya's most powerful witness was yet to come. Your Honor, I call Emma Mitchell to testify on her own behalf. A murmur went through the courtroom. Emma stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked to the witness stand with the composed dignity of someone much older. Emma, Judge Santos said gently, do you understand that you're going to answer some questions about your family? Yes, Your Honor. I want to tell you about what it's like to be autistic and why I need to stay with my daddy. Maya approached the witness stand with visible pride. Emma, can you explain what happened in the photograph Mr. Goldman showed earlier? Emma's answer was clear, clinical, devastating. I was having a sensory overload because the construction noise and the pattern disruption made my nervous system feel unsafe. Daddy was getting my weighted blanket and noise-canceling headphones because he learned that trying to talk to me or touch me during a sensory storm makes it worse. What would have happened if he had tried to stop your headbanging? It would have been really scary and made the overload last longer. Headbanging gives my nervous system the deep pressure it needs to regulate. It's not violence, it's medicine. Goldman's cross-examination was the mistake that lost Eleanor the case. Emma, wouldn't you like to live in a house where you didn't have to have these episodes? Emma's eyes flashed with something that made grown adults in the courtroom lean forward. Mr. Goldman, I don't want to live in a house where I have to pretend not to be autistic. That would be like asking Alex to pretend not to be good at math, or asking Ben to pretend not to be thoughtful, or asking you to pretend not to be confused about autism. The courtroom erupted in barely suppressed laughter. Even Judge Santos's mouth twitched with what might have been a smile. Emma, Goldman continued desperately, don't you want to get better? Emma's response silenced the entire courtroom. I don't want to get better, sir. I want to get understood. When you hear someone speak their truth with that kind of clarity and courage, it changes something fundamental in your understanding of what strength looks like. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone stood up for exactly who they were, despite pressure to be someone else? Share that story in the comments. These moments of authentic courage deserve to be celebrated. Judge Santos called a 15-minute recess, but when she returned, her decision was written in her expression before she spoke a word. I've heard compelling testimony from all parties, she began. The petitioners argue that intensive behavioral modification will help these children integrate into mainstream society. The respondent argues that acceptance and accommodation of neurological differences will allow them to thrive as they are. She looked directly at the children, then at James, then at Eleanor. This court finds that Emma, Alexander, and Benjamin Mitchell are remarkable individuals whose autism is not a disorder to be eliminated but a neurological difference to be celebrated. They demonstrate exceptional intelligence, emotional maturity, and self-advocacy skills that exceed many adults. Eleanor's face went white. Furthermore, this court finds that James Mitchell has demonstrated growth, commitment, and love in learning to support his children's authentic selves, rather than forcing them to conform to neurotypical expectations. Judge Santos's voice grew firm, final. Custody remains with the father. The children will continue to live in an environment that celebrates their differences rather than seeking to eliminate them. Emma, Alex, and Ben erupted in quiet cheers, their joy contained but unmistakable. James felt tears streaming down his face as Maya squeezed his shoulder with fierce pride. But as they gathered their things to leave the victorious courtroom, Eleanor's voice cut through their celebration like a blade. "This isn't over, James. I'll appeal. I'll fight this until those children get the help they need." Emma turned to face her grandmother with a fearless honesty that had just won their case. "Grandma Eleanor," she said clearly, "we already have all the help we need. We have a daddy who learned to love us exactly the way we are." As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, James realized that this victory was bigger than custody, bigger than one family's struggle. 3 autistic children had just taught an entire legal system that different didn't mean broken. And their revolution was just beginning. 6 months after the custody hearing that changed everything, the Mitchell apartment had transformed into something that looked like a cross between a children's museum and a neuroscience laboratory. Emma's mathematical art covered the walls, geometric patterns that spiraled into infinity, architectural blueprints for sensory-friendly playgrounds, and color-coded maps of Manhattan's sound frequencies that had caught the attention of urban planning professors at Columbia University. Alex's organizational systems had evolved into something approaching genius. The living room featured modular furniture that could be rearranged according to daily sensory needs, storage solutions that accommodated both neurotypical visitors and autistic family members, and a central workspace where his engineering projects grew more sophisticated each week. Ben's communication innovations had become the foundation for something larger than any of them had imagined. His symbol cards and gesture systems were being studied by speech therapists. His selective approach to verbal communication had inspired new understanding of energy conservation in neurodivergent individuals, and his quiet wisdom had become the emotional center that held their transformed family together. James stood in the kitchen, preparing breakfast according to the sensory-friendly protocols that were now second nature, watching his children through the pass-through window as they worked on their latest collaborative project. They were building a 3-dimensional model of their ideal school, an institution designed by autistic minds for autistic learners, complete with quiet zones, movement areas, and learning environments that honored different neurological styles. "Daddy," Emma called out, her voice bright with the confidence that had replaced her morning anxiety, "Maya's here." Maya Santos entered the apartment carrying a briefcase and wearing the smile of someone bringing extraordinarily good news. Over the past 6 months, she'd become more than their advocate. She'd become family in the way that some people earn through choice rather than biology. "Good morning, brilliant minds," she said, settling at the kitchen island where the children gathered like planets orbiting a beloved star. "I have news that's going to change everything." Alex looked up from his engineering sketches with the focused attention he reserved for truly important information. "Good change or challenging change?" "Definitely good change," Maya replied, opening her briefcase to reveal documents that looked official and exciting. "The Department of Education wants to fund a pilot program based on your school design." The words hung in the air like magic waiting to be believed. Emma's eyes went wide with the wonder of someone whose wildest dreams were suddenly becoming reality. "Our school," she whispered. "They want to build our actual school?" "Not just build it," Maya continued, her voice warm with pride and possibility. "They want you 3 to be consultants on the design. They want autistic children to help create educational environments that actually work for autistic minds." Ben, who had been quietly organizing colored pencils by wavelength, looked up with rare excitement. "Would other kids like us be able to go there? Kids who think in patterns and need quiet spaces and process information differently?" "That's exactly the idea," Maya said. "A school where stimmying is celebrated, where sensory needs are accommodated, where different communication styles are honored, and where brilliant autistic minds can flourish without having to pretend to be neurotypical." James felt something swell in his chest that was bigger than pride, deeper than love. It was the recognition that his children weren't just surviving in a world that didn't understand them. They were changing that world, one revolutionary idea at a time. "There's more," Maya continued, pulling out additional documents. "Dr. Rodriguez wants to document your family's journey for a research paper on autism acceptance versus autism intervention." And the video you made that night? It's being used in training programs for social workers, teachers, and family court judges across the country. Emma climbed onto James's lap with the easy affection of a child who'd learned that love meant acceptance rather than conditions. "Daddy, remember when you thought we were broken?" "I remember," James said, his voice thick with emotions he was still learning to name. "I remember being scared that I didn't know how to help you." "But you did help us," Alex said matter-of-factly. "You learned our language instead of making us speak yours. You stopped trying to fix us and started seeing us," Ben added quietly. James looked at his children, these remarkable, autistic, extraordinary individuals who taught him that love meant celebration rather than correction, and felt the last of his old fears dissolve like morning mist in sunlight. "What I learned," he said slowly, "is that you were never broken. I was just looking at you wrong." Maya pulled out her phone, checking messages with the expression of someone juggling multiple exciting projects. "Speaking of looking at things differently, I have one more surprise." She turned her phone screen toward them, showing a video call interface. On the screen were three faces that made the children erupt in delighted recognition: Dr. Rodriguez, Judge Santos, and Rebecca the paramedic, all calling in from different locations. "We wanted to see how our favorite autism advocates were doing," Dr. Rodriguez said, her warm voice filling the apartment through the phone speaker. "Emma, Alex, Ben," Judge Santos added with the fondness of someone who'd watched courage change her own understanding of justice. "I've been sharing your story with other judges. You're helping families all over the country." Rebecca's smile was bright with professional pride and personal affection. "And Maya tells me you're designing a school? I want to send my nephew there when it opens." The video call turned into an impromptu celebration as the children showed off their latest projects, explained their school design innovations, and demonstrated how their communication systems had evolved. Watching his kids interact with these adults who saw their autism as a gift rather than a deficit, James realized something profound. His children weren't just accepted, they were celebrated, consulted, and recognized as the experts on their own experiences. When the call ended, Emma returned to her architectural drawings with renewed focus, adding details that reflected input from their adult collaborators. Alex began calculating structural requirements for sensory-friendly classroom designs. Ben worked on communication protocols that would help autistic and neurotypical children understand each other. As evening approached, James found himself standing at the apartment's windows, looking out at the city where his children would soon help build something revolutionary. The surveillance cars were long gone, replaced by a world that had learned to see autism differently because 3 6-year-old children had refused to be ashamed of their beautiful minds. Maya joined him at the window, her expression content with the satisfaction of someone who'd helped rewrite the story of what was possible. "James," she said quietly, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd given up? If you'd let Eleanor take them?" James thought about the children his kids might have become under intensive compliance training. Quiet, compliant, their brilliant minds trained to hide their authentic selves behind masks of neurotypical performance. He thought about Emma's mathematical genius suppressed in favor of forced eye contact, Alex's organizational brilliance labeled as obsessive disorder, Ben's thoughtful communication style eliminated through speech forcing. They would have survived, he said finally. But they wouldn't have been themselves. And now, James looked at his children, who were planning a school that would change education, creating art that challenged perceptions, and developing innovations that would help other autistic families thrive. Now they're changing the world by being exactly who they are. As bedtime approached, the children gathered for their evening routine, a carefully choreographed dance of sensory regulation, emotional check-ins, and family connection that honored everyone's neurological needs. Emma sorted through her collection of smooth stones, choosing the ones that felt right for nighttime comfort. Alex arranged his sleep environment according to optimal texture and temperature variables. Ben wrote in his daily journal, processing the day's experiences through careful reflection. "Daddy," Emma said as James tucked her weighted blanket around her small frame, "are you proud of us?" James looked down at his daughter, this brilliant, autistic, revolutionary little girl who'd taught an entire legal system about the difference between broken and different, and felt his heart expand with love so fierce it took his breath away. "Emma, I'm not just proud of you. I'm honored to be your father. Even though we're autistic. Especially because you're autistic. Your autism makes you see the world in ways that help make it better for everyone." As the apartment settled into peaceful quiet, James stood in his children's doorway watching them sleep. Tomorrow, they would continue building their school design. Next week, they would consult with education officials who wanted to learn from their insights. Next month, they would help train teachers who were ready to celebrate autism rather than cure it. But tonight, they were simply three beautiful children, safely home with a father who'd learned that love meant seeing them exactly as they were and celebrating the extraordinary gifts that came with being beautifully, brilliantly, authentically autistic. Outside their windows, the city hummed with the quiet energy of 8 million people learning to make room for differences that made the world more interesting, more innovative, and more whole. And in apartment 4B on East 72nd Street, a family slept peacefully, knowing that they'd not only survived the battle to stay together, they'd won the war to be themselves. The revolution that started with 3 children refusing to be ashamed of their autism had grown into something beautiful beyond imagination. And it was just the beginning. If you thought this billionaire's secret was wild, wait until you see the story of the maid who exposed her boss on live TV. Watch it here.